So glad that you all have chosen to be a part of this. My name is Paul Basden. This is Jim Johnson. Jim is going to be speaking tomorrow morning at the services that you'll be at. It's going to be a marvelous message. And so he asked if I would kick us off today, then he'll jump in a little bit later, then we'll have Q&A. The topic that's actually written up is just simply this: what does God want me to do? And of course, that's a huge question. And actually, the title of this weekend is What God Wants You to Do, which is live with him in his kingdom. I mean, on an everyday basis, like whether it's Monday through Sunday, any day you wake up, anytime during the day, if you simply ask yourself, what does God want me to do? The answer is, he wants you to let Jesus teach you how to live in his kingdom, when you're at school, when you're at sports, when you're at home. And most of that is going to be common sense, fused with a whole lot of scripture and prayer and Christian friends and ministry. In other words, every day, God doesn't want you to go to school and not have prepared for any tests, pray real hard, then when you don't know the answer, cheat off someone's paper. That's not God's will for you. That's not what he wants. Because the way of truth is the way of God. So anytime you and I live in non-truth or non-honesty, we are not in God's kingdom. And so he wants us to live in his kingdom. And clearly, every day he wants you to love other people as you love yourself, or even more than that, as Jesus loved you. And that's all sorts of actions and behavior and words that, I'll give you an example. If somebody's being picked on, being bullied, you have the opportunity to be kind to them, to come along beside them, to say the right words. Why? Because words are important, because Jesus is an encourager, and you can be an encourager, right? So those are just the things in the course of a day that God wants you to do on a regular basis. Here's a tough one. He wants you to listen to and respect and honor your parents. I didn't always like that when I was your age, but the truth is they've been around the block more than us. And so there's just things out there. Learning to respect people who know more than us is a real sign of maturity. Anyway, those are just the simple things during the day, right? Every day. But then there are these moments that come along when you say, okay, now God, I don't see a real answer for me right there. And that's what Jim and I want to spend our time on today. So I want to zero in on when I was 16, between 16 and 22. And I want to talk about just some, out of my story, some significant decisions that I made that I feel like God led me in. And I specifically want to share with you what I think is just one principle to hold on to, okay? In John chapter 10, Jesus said, "My sheep hear my voice and they know me." Did you know that when you were a baby, and you cried, if there was a room of 10 babies crying and all the backs were to your mother would know your voice. She could pick it out. And in time, right, have you ever been in that situation where you're with a bunch of your friends doing something and you hear this really obnoxious voice calling you and you're going, crying out loud, why did my mom and dad call me? They didn't even call you by name. They just said son, daughter, but you know their name, you know their voice. Well, Jesus said, "My sheep know my voice, and they follow me." So at the age of 16, at a conference very similar to this, in fact, it was for our whole church. It was not just for students, it was for our whole church. I heard or met Jesus in a brand new way. Let me explain. I was born as a pastor's kid, and so what that means is I was at church all the time. I had great parents, but I just never put two and two together. That is, following Jesus means you love him. I thought following Jesus meant you went to church, and in my case, you hung out with the guys and told gross jokes, and then you hung out with the girls and tried to impress them. Sometimes telling gross jokes because you're so stupid you think that's what girls want to hear. And so that's what I did 14, 15, 16, and I just thought that that's what you did. You went to church, you were kind of religious on Sundays, and then Monday through Saturday you were basically a nice person that wouldn't get arrested. And that was my sense of what being a Christian was. At 16, I heard these high school kids, college kids, and adults that came from 6 states to the state where we lived in Virginia, and they spoke to us. It was called a lay renewal weekend. You know what renewal means? You need to be renewed when you're dying. And our church was dying. And spiritually, I was dying. I didn't know it, but I was, because I wasn't really living with Christ. And so I listened to these speakers, and they kept talking about how being a Christian meant knowing Jesus and walking with him and loving him. One of the leaders who had someone else's phone, my guess is it was his. And so I kept hearing them talk about this relational aspect of following Jesus that I just didn't know. I had no idea that you could talk to him like you would talk to a close friend. I had no idea that when he said do something that he was serious And the reason was because he knew better than I did. I had no idea that there are certain things I could do that would distance me from him on a regular basis. And if I kept doing those, I would never know his love and his presence. And so at the end of that first night, having heard, it's just like last night when you went home, except y'all went to different homes. I went back to my home. And I said to my mom, I said, Mom, here's what happened. I told her. And I said, do you think that's really what you and Dad have taught me for the last 16 years that I didn't put together? She goes, son, that's all we've taught you. We've tried to teach you to follow Jesus and to understand him and to love him. I said, well, I didn't get it. I just thought it meant going to church, being nice on Sundays, and like just not being arrested during the week and pushing every boundary you could in religious ways. Right. So the next day I went back, and the next day I went back, and by the end of that weekend on Sunday morning in my church, I stood up in front of 70 or 80 kids in the student ministry because the question was, what did you learn from this weekend? And I said, well, I learned that Jesus wants me to follow him. And I'm sure the adults were thinking, well, no duh on that one. But for me, it was a big duh because I had never caught that. So over the next several months, I just got my Bible out and I read it. And I know so many of y'all are doing this. You're way ahead of where I was. But I was reading it and I was praying and I was finding other Christian friends. And we weren't just talking about stupid stuff. We were talking about what it meant to know Jesus and to follow him. And then I realized that in my high school, there were a group of us guys who loved the Lord and needed to be together and build friendships. And so I started a Bible study in my high school that spring of my sophomore year. And I was terrible at it. I'd never read the Bible hardly. I didn't know it. And so I just brought in guest speakers. And then when the guest speakers didn't come, I had to say something. So then I began to prepare. And then I noticed that our youth group just was dead as a doornail. So I asked if I could lead a small group, then our youth group that turned into about 100 kids every single Saturday night. So every Friday night, every Saturday night, I was leading Bible studies all through sophomore, junior, and high school, senior year. And I wasn't doing it because I wanted to be a pastor. I was doing it because I loved Jesus, and I knew that he wanted me to help other people love him and follow him. So this was all new for me, brand new. I was 18, and a lady in our church who, along with her husband, had been missionaries in China and had to come home when the communist coup occurred or they would be killed. They got out very, very just easily under the cover of night, difficultly just under the cover of night, but made it home. They were retired missionaries, and she was so wise. And one night before Sunday night church, she said to me, Paul, I pray for you because I know you're one of the leaders in the youth group. I pray for other kids too. How can I pray for you? Her name was Mrs. Coffin, C-A-U-T-H-E-N. I said, well, Mrs. Coffin, I'll tell you what you can pray for. I said, at night lately, I've been lying awake in bed. I'm 18 years old, wondering, God, what is my future? Like, what am I supposed to do? I always wanted to either be a lawyer or play for the Dallas Cowboys. And it's fairly clear of those two, which I might be able to do just possibly, which is obviously be the lawyer. But I said, what do you want me to do, Lord? And I would just lie in bed thinking, I wonder if this is what a pastor does. Because I never knew what Daddy did. He died when I was young. So I said, I just wonder if this is what it is. And she said, well, tell me what you think. I said, well, I wonder if I'm supposed to be a pastor. She goes, well, let me ask you a question. She goes, can you think of any reason God would not want you to be a pastor? I wasn't smart enough to think of a lot of reasons. And I just said, no, ma'am. She said, do you think you'd like to? I said, yes. If it's what I'm doing now, shepherding people to know Christ, then I want to do that. She said, well, then consider yourself called. That was her 3-word answer to my question of my whole life. What am I going to do with my entire life? She said, consider yourself called. And I said, well, Miss Coffin, and I was kind of bold to say this. I said, that sounds really good, but I don't think that that's enough for me. She said, why? I said, because I'm looking for something big and dynamic and dramatic. I want to hear God's voice. I wanted to say, Basden, this is for you. And just for you to say, consider yourself called, I'm not sure that really carries all the weight I need it to. And she said, I guess you think you're like the Apostle Paul and you want to have this big, glaring vision from heaven. Now, what she didn't say was, if you're as important to the kingdom of God as the Apostle Paul was, he'd give you one of those. But since you're not, he's not. And that's also true. And so I kept talking to her, and then here was her statement, and this is the principle that has guided me now for all these years. She said, instead of listening for this big, dynamic, dramatic voice, why don't you listen for a quiet, unassuming voice? Now, people have different personalities. Some of you are quiet. You're real comfortable with quiet, unassuming voices. I'm an extrovert that talks to trees. I talk to dogs. I talk to neighbors. I talk to any of you that I'll see on Sunday if you want. If you give me any eye contact, I'll say hello. So I'm always chit-chatting with people. So I don't do well at listening to still, quiet, small, unassuming voices. But I thanked her, and I went home. I began to pray about it and never had this big vision, never have. But more and more, I had this quiet inner awareness that if I could do anything with my life, that's what I would like to do. Within a few months, I had to make a decision about college. Back then, you didn't decide when you were a freshman in college. In high school, you didn't have to take all your AP courses and decide what your entire future is when you're 14. It was nice. At 18, we can kind of still decide where to go to college. And so I was praying about it. And once again, I had an option over here that would involve some scholarships back in Virginia. But in this case, my sister was at Baylor. My mentor who was in college was at Baylor. And I said, I'm just going to go to Baylor. And it was just this quiet sense it was the right thing. 3 years later, I met a girl on campus named Denise O'Brien. First time we met was in a 747 on the way to a mission trip in Southeast Asia. We weren't impressed with each other, but so it is when you're 18. And then just a little bit later, we thrown together in some groups and began to date. And it began getting serious, and I knew where this was going. It was either going to a significant commitment that I sure didn't want to make at 21, or it was going to go for a breakup. And I'd been through those on both ends. I'd been dumped. I was the dumpy and the dumper, so I just wasn't sure what to do. And my college roommate, who I talked to this morning on the phone, just so graciously, again, the same kind of thing. What in the world else would you be looking for? I said, I know, but I'm just waiting to hear those bells from heaven like, ding, 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 this is the person, because you got to spend your life with them, come on. Get to spend your life with them, come on. And pretty soon I was aware that the quiet voice of God was saying, this is the girl. If you miss her, you've missed everything. The same kind of thing happened when I made a decision about where to go to seminary. The same thing happened when Jim and I made the decision to come plant this church. And so what I want to tell you is, God knows you, God loves you, God sees you, He is speaking to you. Often, He's simply telling you, put your clothes on and go to school today. Just simple things. Sometimes He's saying, I want to talk to you about some very important things in life. But if you're looking only for the big voice, for the shout, for the stars, for the stripes, you may not get it. And if you get it, that's wonderful. I'm happy for anybody. And people have told me, said, Paul, I've heard God audibly. I said, praise God. I haven't. But I am developing and have been developing this quiet awareness of His unassuming voice. And that's what I want to leave with you. That's a principle for me that's carried me a long, long way. Now, I don't know if quiet, unassuming voice is not dramatic enough for you. It wasn't for me. Remember when Miss Cawthon told me that? I said, I just need more. But that's because we want God to do things in our way rather than us doing things His way. Are you with me? Because if we go to God and say, I will listen to you if you will absolutely put on a huge laser light show, then God says, well, what if I don't want to put on a laser light show? I just got back this past November. My wife and I went for our 5th time to Israel. And one of the places we go is Mount Carmel. And Mount Carmel's in the northern part of the country. It's where Elijah went and had the big showdown with the prophets of Baal. And you don't have to know the story, but go read 1 Kings 18 to 19 sometime and it will blow you away. And after that experience of Elijah being completely used by God to just shut down the idolatry within the Israelite nation, he hears that Jezebel, the bad queen, wants to kill him, and he's scared. Now, here's a guy that's just been used by God, but now he's scared. And that does show you that sometime in life, we're right on the mountaintop and we hear God's voice, and then pretty soon we're being afraid of stupid things. And he was afraid because he said, gosh, she can kill me. Well, of course, he was exhausted. Like after this weekend, you're going to be spiritually and emotionally exhausted. Do not make big decisions Monday morning. You won't have anything left in you. So Elijah was scared. And so he ran to another place. And when he got there, he wanted God to speak to him. And so he was in a cave, and he kind of walked out to the edge of the cave, and lightning came, and thunder came, and rain came, and wind came. And each time, the author says, but God was not in the wind, and God was not in the rain, and God was not in the storm, and God was not in the lightning. Then it says there was a still small voice, and God spoke to him. So I want to commend to you today the still small voice of the Lord. Live in Jesus in that upside down kingdom world, and you'll tune your ear to hear it better and better. All right, I look forward to the Q&A time. I'm going to pass it on to my good buddy, James Bryant Johnson.
All right, thank you, PB. And let me just also add my greetings. It's such a privilege to be here with you all, because I began to sense God leading me in a specific direction when I was 15 and 16 as well. And it was at an event not unlike this as well. And I do believe that one of the most important things you can do as you grow through adolescence is really begin to ask the question, Lord, What do you want me to do? What do you want me to become? What do you have for me? And I think that's a wonderful question to be thinking about and praying about. But there are a couple of fallacies that were going around in the spiritual world when I was growing up, and they may still be going around for you. And here's what they are. The first one is this. If you're really committed and you really want to follow Jesus, he's probably going to send you to the last place you want to go. Right? So if you really say yes to Jesus, Lord, I'm all yours, he's going to send you to be a missionary in Botswana or Kazakhstan or someplace a long way away. And you have to leave all your friends and leave everyone that you love and care for. And you're going, I don't know, is God really going to want me to go do something that I really wouldn't want to do or I wouldn't be gifted for, or I really wouldn't enjoy doing? And then the other question was this. Well, I keep asking God, he's not answering. And sometimes it felt like God was hiding his will, and so I was having to look here and talk to people there. And so I felt like God at times was playing hide and seek. So here's what I want to just let you know up front is that God doesn't play hide and seek with his kids. He wants you to know what his will is. And the last thing he's going to do as he sees you loving him, following him, giving your heart and soul to him, is to call you and send you to do something you're not wired to do, that you wouldn't find meaning and help and fulfillment in your life to do. There's a book that Paul and I have read for a long, long time, probably 40 years now. It's called Wishful Thinking, a Theological ABC, written by a guy by the name of Frederick Buechner. And in this book, he describes and defines a calling. And here's what he says. The word calling is from the Latin vocare. Is that how you pronounce it? I didn't take Latin. Vocare. Vocare. Yeah, no V. See, I never took Latin. I always said, okay.
My daughter Carrie's Latin.
Carrie, thank you. So the word that we get the word vocation from is vocare. Thank you very much. And it means the place to which one is called. And I love the way Buechner went on to describe that. He says, the place that God is calling you to is where your deep gladness and the world's deep need meet. I haven't forgotten, I heard a lot of things 40 years ago, and I've forgotten all of them, but I haven't forgotten that one. Now here he goes on to explain it this way. He says, you know what? He says, if you're writing commercials for a deodorant company and you're really loving it, well, that's meeting one condition. It's your deep gladness, but the world probably doesn't need more deodorant commercials unless, 7th or 8th grade boys, they might need some. I don't know. So the deal is it didn't meet both of those qualifications. He said, on the other hand, if you are a doctor in a leper colony and you get up every day and deal with that suffering and that loss and it just drains you, and there's no joy in it for you, well, you're meeting one qualification. You're certainly doing something that the world needs to have done, but if it's not your deep gladness, you're missing those two. And so I want to encourage you as you grow through adolescence to be asking that prayer, God, what are you calling me to do? And just start looking and trying to identify, where's your deep gladness? Where do you find affirmation? Where do you feel affirmed by God? And that's what happened to me. I didn't have quite the experience that Paul did leading Bible studies, but I was involved in my student ministry. I got to lead and speak on mission trips and those kinds of things. And all the way through that, I got affirmation both externally from those who were with me and my friends and my leaders, but I also had this internal affirmation inside. And so I began to realize that my deep gladness was probably going to be found in giving my life vocationally to something in ministry or something in the church. And so like Paul, I had to make some decisions along the way. I went to Baylor too. I was always going to go to Texas Tech because I lived in Midland. My parents went to Tech. But I thought, well, hey, I'm called to ministry. That means I got to go to Baylor. So that's how much I thought about it, right? And then I got married too, and I met this beautiful girl, happenstance meeting, chance meeting, and she was way out of my league. She was beautiful and funny. And Paul, I didn't have any consternation over whether it was God's will or not. I said, it's got to be God's will. And so we got married while we were still in college. But here's the thing I want to let you know. In my ministry, God has given me direction about these kinds of important decisions in different ways at different times. Sometimes he has given me that intuitive sense that this is good and right and where I want you to go. In fact, I've been offered a job at the church where I was ordained, and I was invited to be the youth pastor, but I was about to move to Fort Worth and go to seminary, and my pastor kind of pressured me, and I said yes. And as soon as I said yes, I had this deep sense of unrest in my heart and soul, and it stayed with me for a couple of days, and I had to call him back and say, I'm sorry, I can't do this. So sometimes when you're looking to make significant directional decisions in your life, that you'll have this internal intuitive sense. It's hearing the voice of God say, I'm not sure that's for you. On other occasions, I just had this sense that God would kind of orchestrated some things together. We were thinking about moving away from Texas and becoming a pastor in Florida. And that meant leaving our family here in Texas and going to a strange place. And man, we prayed and prayed and prayed, and I never really got any word from God or sense that we're supposed to go. But it was deadline time, and so we were reading through Oswald Chambers' books, My Utmost for His Highest. And it was the morning we had to decide. And so it was February the 12th, I believe, and I read it. And I can't remember exactly the words. I need to go back and read it again, but it simply said this, hey, if you're really willing to follow God, you have to be willing to go where you're unknown and where you get no credit and where you have, nothing that you're aware of, and you have to be willing to do that. And I was going, well, God, is this you speaking? And as I went through that experience, I determined that he was leading through that. But then there's one time, and this is what I want to leave you with, this is a story, is that I came, before I went to Florida, I was finishing my PhD at Baylor. I was the interim pastor at a church called Calvary Baptist Church. And they kept asking me, hey, do you want to come become our pastor? We feel like God's calling you and leading us to you. And I was going, the average age of the church was like 73. I mean, their young adult Sunday school department had an average attendance of 4. And I'm going, no, I don't want to go there. That's not for me. And yet I kept praying and I kept praying. And listen, here's the way I always say it. When you have a big decision, when you're trying to discern God's will, always, always, always pray first. Give God every opportunity to speak, to give you that intuitive sense, to listen to wise people around you, like Paul listened to Mrs. Cawthon. But I got nothing. And once again, it was time to make a decision. And my wife was pregnant about 4 months. And if some of you, who are leading, some of you ladies in here who have kids, like when you're 6 months pregnant, you're not feeling spiritual. You're not thinking much about anything. She goes, hey, honey, I'm pregnant. You could be called to the First Baptist Church of Honolulu. I couldn't tell you what God would be saying. And so I just felt alone until once again, I had to decide I got nothing from God. And I came to this decision. I came to the decision that sometimes God allows us the freedom to choose and make a choice on our own. And when he does that, he's being gracious to us, but it's also a test. That is, that sometimes God wants us to make a decision, and with whatever decision we make, we're showing God something about our values, about our hopes and dreams and aspirations. And so I never imagined that I would be the pastor of a dying church in the inner city of Waco, and yet it was one of the most fulfilling and exciting times in my life. And I think because I chose that in that moment, God recognized that my heart was to follow him and to give my life to some people, again, where I might not get all the stuff out of it that I wanted, but I was willing to go there. And he blessed me in that. And about that time, I began to understand Matthew 25, verse 14 through 30. And it's a parable of the talents. Many of you perhaps have heard this. And it's a parable where Jesus talks about a master who gives large bags of gold to 3 of his servants. I mean, significant amounts of money. And he says, hey, I'm going away and I'm entrusting 5 bags to you and 2 bags to you and 1 bag to you. And listen, it's up to you. I'm entrusting this to you. And the only catch is I'm going to come back someday and you're going to have to give an account of what you did with all these resources. And you see, the deal was he really entrusted him. Like there was no email then. There were no long distance phone calls. They literally had to make the decision about where to invest this money based on what they knew and understood about their master. And the guy who got 5 bags of gold, he invested his and doubled his money. The guy who got 2 bags of gold, he invested his and he doubled his as well. And then the one person who only got 1 bag said, I'm not sure I can trust my master. I'm just going to hide my 1 bag of gold. And then one day, the master comes back. And the one who had 5 said, look, master, what I've done for you, I've got 10 now. And the same for the one who had 2, I've got 4 now. And the one who had 1 and hid it and buried it, he says, sorry, buddy, you're fired. You're out of here because you didn't trust me and you didn't even put it in a bank or a place where you could get interest. And then he turned to each one and said, well done, good and faithful servants. You've been faithful in small things. I'm going to put you in charge of things in my eternal kingdom. Well, I'd just been processing that. And my middle son was 3 years old at that time. And he'd gotten one of those old-fashioned block sets, for Christmas, like, big blocks with pieces about this size made out of wood. And I sat down and kind of showed him how to work with them and build things. And I came home from my classwork one day, and he was in the kitchen on the linoleum floor, and he was building stuff with his blocks. I said, hey, Tyler, you go ahead, play with your blocks, do that. I'm going to be in here reading the paper. I wanted to, have some time to myself and debrief a little bit. I said, you go play with the blocks. And after a few minutes, I hear him calling me from the kitchen. Dad, come here. I want to show you something. Now, he's 3. I walked in there. He said, Dad, look what I built for you. And it was a church. He's 3. And here's the deal. I mean, I was floored. And here's what made it so special. I could have sat with him on the floor and I said, hey, Tyler, put this block here and that block here and this block here and that block there and that block there. And I could have built that church and I would have felt okay that he at least put the blocks where I told him to. But what he did was he took the resources that I gave him, those blocks, and knowing me and knowing what I valued and knowing what I loved, he built something for me. And here's one of the most wonderful truths that I get out of that. You've been given incredible gifts and opportunities and education, spiritual gifts. And God's going to give you direction along the way in different ways that are specific, intuitive. You're going to know and hear that small voice, but sometimes he's going to let you choose. And when he does, I want you to remember this story and say, you know what? I have all these abilities and all these gifts, and one day I'm going to have to give an account to God for what I did with my life. And I want to challenge you to build something with your life, to accomplish something, to serve some cause, to give your life to something so that one day when you stand before God, then you can say, Dad, look what I have for you. Look what I made for you. And he will look at you and say, well done, my good and faithful daughter, my good and faithful son. You've been faithful in a few small things, but now I'm going to put you in charge of many things in my eternal kingdom. So I hope and pray indeed that you will hear that still small voice, that intuitive sense will be clear at times. And sometimes when you have the opportunity, that you build the best possible life you can, that one day you can present to God. All right.
Great job. All right, you guys are up, girls are up, whatever kind of questions you want. We got exactly 15 minutes, and we're going to let you guys out at exactly 4:30. So if you have something, we've got microphones here, and we will repeat the question because this is being taped for groups that weren't able to be here that will want to watch this later.
This goes to what you both said. You both said you went to Baylor. Were you friends at Baylor together?
Not really.
We were
year
acquaintances.
We were a year apart, and in college, if you're a year apart, you might never see the person. We knew each other just barely. We became friends at seminary. I can't see with the hoodie down. Who is that?
Matt.
Thank you, brother.
Paul was involved in BSU, and he was incredibly spiritual. I was in a fraternity, and I was part-time spiritual. So I should have known Paul at Baylor, but I didn't. You're going to write that down? Yeah. Yeah. Follow Paul most of the time, me occasionally. That's what.
I'll just keep the microphone. I'm sure, I mean, like, with what we've been listening to with Ashley speaking and what we've been breaking down in our small groups, we're talking about God's kingdom versus our kingdom or our me kingdom. So I'm sure that this might be on some folks' mind here. What can we do outside of participating here at PTSM to build God's kingdom outside of church?
Let's get first.
You may go. Well, certainly one of the things that our PTSM does is we do mission trips and mission to Arlington and all those kinds of things. And you're kind of at that point in life where your life is pretty well planned for you, right? I mean, you go to school all the time, you got homework, you have extracurriculars, and you're doing PTSM in your high school small groups or here on the weekends. So there's not a lot of opportunities outside of that. And so what you have to begin to think about is, how is my school, how is my team, how are my other outside extracurricular activities, how is that my mission field? And how does God want to use me in those moments? And really, how does God want me to use in this class? So it really, sometimes we tend to think, and Paul was saying this, we tend to think that being a part of God's big kingdom and doing great things is all the spectacular stuff. But it really is made up of all the ordinary, everyday stuff, where you recognize that God is with you and wanting to guide you and use you in the normal, everyday things that you do.
Yeah. What comes to my mind also is in John 13, we're told about, John gives some different insights than Matthew, Mark, and Luke do at the point of Lord's Supper. Matthew, Mark, and Luke talk about going to an upper room and they share a Passover meal together. John's gospel, he talks about how Jesus washed their feet.
Yeah.
And, I just would not want to wash any of your feet. I'll go on record right now. And you probably wouldn't want to wash anybody else's feet in here. It's a menial job. Back then, it was actually reserved for slaves, but it was the one thing that a slave was supposed to do when you came in a home, was wash your feet, because you wore open-toed shoes often. It was sandy and dusty, and Israel's desert, most of it. And so your feet are going to be hot, and they're going to be sweaty and, dirty. So it's kind to wash a person's feet. It was the equivalent of giving somebody today a glass of iced tea or a cold, bottle of water or something when they come in. And so that night when Jesus washed their feet, it blew them away. In fact, they said, "We don't really want you to do this." They were embarrassed that he did that. Yeah. And at the end, he said, "I've shown you what you're supposed to do." And so to the question of how do you live in the kingdom outside PTSM, et cetera, I just say, ask Jesus, say, "Show me whom I can serve today in your name. Show me how I can serve you by helping another person." Just like Jim said, it might be different if you're an athlete in this sport. It might be different if you're on the dance team here. It might be different if you're playing music in this particular thing. It might be different if you're a gamer. Or just what does it look like for you to actually serve another person? To serve another person means you do what's necessary to help them be successful. And every time you do that, you're turning things upside down, because that's not what the world does. The world says, take, take, take. And Jesus says, well, how about you give? You know, well, that's not very fun, Jesus. Well, he said, well, actually, yes, it is. You know, you might get crucified a few times, but actually, it's actually very fun. It's the only way to live. Okay. Great question. Thanks. I saw another mic right there.
I have a question. How did you, when you got your calling, how did you know that you wanted to do, like, I guess adult pastor wouldn't be, like, the right term, but, like, not a youth pastor? Because you said you didn't want to be, like, with the average age was 73 years old. Yeah. Did you ever think about being, like, a youth pastor?
Let's repeat that question.
Okay.
All right, so the question is, how did you know you wanted to be a pastor of adults as opposed to working with youth? And I'd say, I'll go first this time. Yeah. In my case, when I finished college and started seminary, the one thing I didn't want to do was pastor adults. I wanted to work with students. I loved working with students in college. I tried to get a job working in a college, working with high school students, with college students, but there weren't any openings. And so I ended up working as a youth minister for 5 years in a church. And it wasn't the church I wanted to go to, but it's the church I'm glad I went to, and I'm glad God called me. It was a great experience. And at 27, I thought, you know, I think I actually have something to say to adults now, and I'd like to go do that. Jim had something to say to adults long before I did. He can share that story with you.
Yeah, it's really interesting. My student ministry, in one sense, really shaped me, but I also had a really hurtful experience in my student ministry. And it set me back for a year or two, but ultimately God used that to redeem my thinking and my way of understanding what it means to follow him. So that kind of gave me a little bit of a bitter taste towards student ministry. But my first job in ministry, I was a youth pastor for a summer. I was a summer youth pastor, but the church couldn't afford me through the rest of the time. And then from there, I was called to a little church outside of Troy, Texas. It was called Bell Falls, and it averaged, there were 15 people enrolled in the Sunday school department, and I preached to the same 8 to 10 people for 3 years. And yet, I had the opportunity then to start preaching and teaching on a regular basis, and God used that experience in my life to really help me to begin to focus on speaking to adults. So
to your question, I think one of the principles that's important here is God doesn't call everybody the same way.
Yeah.
And there's not a right or wrong. It's not like Jim did it the right way and I did it the wrong way. God doesn't look at individuals like that. He goes, go read the end of John's gospel, and Simon Peter says, you want me to follow you, but what about John? And Jesus goes, that's irrelevant. I'm talking to you, just you. Yeah. I'll figure out what I'm doing with John. So if he calls you to something, don't compare yourself with anyone else. That's hard, but it'll be in your heart. You'll know. Like I just knew I wasn't ready to pastor, and he knew he was. And
how do you get over the fear of like trusting God with those big decisions? And if you have like an answer that's like besides pray or just like trust him or read the Bible, I'd appreciate that.
Why don't you repeat the question?
Yeah, the question is, how do you follow and know God's will in these big kinds of situations, but without thinking about praying or reading the Bible? Okay, was that it? Did I get that right? Here's what I would say. As much as that sounds cliche and Jesus juking to say you got to read the Bible and pray, those are two indispensable things. And here's why. Is that the way that trust is built, okay? And so one of the reasons why you read Scripture is because it's the story of God's faithfulness to his people throughout the generations. So it is only through reading the Bible that you get a sense that, hey, God is trustworthy, all right? And then the other thing is, in simply praying, it is not simply trying to tell God what I want, but it's trying to say, okay, I just want to listen here. And so what I had to do is, yes, whenever I took some steps, I initially was afraid, but when I took those steps in faith, God was faithful. And I went, okay. And so as I look back across my life, and I think Paul could say the same thing, every step along the way when I had to make a decision that was taking a step that I didn't know what was going to happen, what was going on, God has been faithful. So the Bible is what gives you a good idea that you can trust God. And then praying is a way that you can hear from him and allow him to guide and direct you. But I do think, other than those two things, you just have to take the step out. You have to get to the point that you're willing to step outside the circle of your own self-sufficiency and say, okay, I'm going to trust God. But as long as you're only doing stuff that you can do on your own, God doesn't need to really be at work in your life. But it's when you take that step of faith, then you have the opportunity to see him work and affirm that step that you took.
Yep. Great question also. And the only thing I would add is Jim used the phrase looking back, and that'd be my answer. Most of the time I didn't know. It's not possible to know. If we knew, it wouldn't be faith. It's just like God says, do this. You go, well, obviously I'm going to go do that. But I never knew. And that's why I only know looking in the rearview mirrors.
Yeah.
I've never known looking through the windshield. It's just later on I'll look in the mirror and I go, dear God, thank you. I mean, Denise and I got married at 22. Jim and Robin got married at 20. Talk about knowing being immature enough to ruin things. We were immature enough to ruin everything. And yet, by God's grace, we made it. And we didn't know when we came down here if this church was going to fly. And let me tell you, when we were sitting there and we found out that we were on a waiting list for elementary schools to get in to start a new church here, and there was no building in Frisco that was decent or attractive, or some terrible cheer academy in old downtown Frisco that was about destroyed. That was a defunct place. It was about the closest thing we could find that we might want to try to use. We had no idea. And so when we came here and we left money on the table and left our families and left friends and churches that didn't want us to leave, man, we had no idea. So people will say, aren't you amazed at what's happened here? Probably more than anybody in the world. Jim and I are more amazed than anybody that there's a Preston Trail Church that would have this for you all. Because we had no idea. We just felt like it was the right step. We moved forward, and there were a lot of stumblings and a lot of joys. And so you just don't know. But as Jim said, you can trust God, and he'll even help you. I'd made one mistake, I believe. I really think I missed God's call. But God redeems that. I mean, God will not let you make a bad mistake and then say, well, there you go, eat that, buddy. He goes, no, I love you. I'll redeem that. And I moved my family halfway across the country, and they know it. I think I missed God's call on my life. But he still blessed it. Yeah, thanks. I think we have time for one more. I saw the mic.
I'm right here. Hi. So my question, it's kind of niche to a lot of the seniors in the room. So we have a lot of girls and gentlemen that they're having to decide, what school they go to. And, they're making a big decision in that sense. So how can you mitigate if you ever feel like you've made the wrong decision?
Repeat that last part.
How can you navigate or mitigate whenever you think that you may have made the wrong decision in following, the calling that you think God gave for you?
You can repeat that
You
question.
go ahead.
I'll repeat the question. When you have a big decision in front of you, whatever age you are, but specifically she's relating to some of the older high school kids, but whatever age you are, big decision, how do you know what to do if you feel like you made the wrong step? Yeah. I just gave my example. 34 years old, paralyzed by criticism, conflict, rejection by just a handful of people in my church, but it was enough to knock me out. I wish it hadn't. I'd love to say I'm such a strong, wonderful guy that, I told all those people where to go and I walked right through it, but I didn't. It really got to me. And so as a result of that, and by the way, I didn't know back then that was codependence. I now know that I've been codependent most of my life, and that's what I have to give to Jesus every day. But as a result, my sense of being close to God was kind of broken. And I was having, to her point, I was having quiet time and reading the Bible every day. And yet I could not find what it meant to walk with the Lord and just simply talk to people honestly about problems. And I was building it up, and it finally just exploded. And I told Denise, never again, never another church, never another pastorate. I'm done. I'm going to go academics. I'm going to go to university. And by the grace of God and through Denise's dad, I was able to find this job and go to work at a Christian university in Birmingham, Alabama. And I mean, as soon as I got there, it was like, what a stupid decision. And I remember I came to Denise one day. We'd been there about 2 weeks. I said, honey, I've gotten a letter from the people back in our church. They said, we're not doing anything until you come back. We love you. I said, I think I made the dumbest decision. Our girls hadn't been here but a couple weeks. We really should look at moving back. Now, I just moved my family halfway across the country. We were living with Denise's parents and her grandmother, so 4 generations, a grandmom, parents, us as parents, and our 2 kids, in a 3-bedroom house. Denise and I were sleeping on a sofa with Carrie at our feet. And
It's amazing you're still married.
it is. For more reasons than you know. And so I told Denise, I said, but don't you think that we should maybe go back? Because I felt so bad about it. And she cried, and then she yelled. Carrie can tell you she's a gentle yeller, but she's not opposed to yelling. And she yelled, and she said, don't you ever move our family halfway across the country into a 3-bedroom home and tell me that this was not God's will. I said, crap. What do you do? And so I began leaning into it heavy. I said, okay, Lord, so what does this mean? I think what it means is I have to, the phrase I used was that old one you've heard, if you make your bed, you got to sleep in it. I thought, so I got to live with this. And then I realized I didn't have a theology for make a bad decision and feel bad. Like I had a lot of good decisions, felt good. So now all of a sudden I made a decision that looking back I think was not the right one, and I just felt terrible about it. And I was unhappy and lonely and just reviewing and ruining the whole experience. I actually went into some depression and actually started going to Catholic Retreat Center every 3 months for 2 days to fast and pray just to find God again. And I would write in my journal and I'd cry, and it was pathetic. But it was also healing. So I just leaned into it and said, Lord, whatever you want me to do, I'm all yours. And I don't want to miss it again. And I think it was a little dramatic on my part, but still, God was so gracious to just come, and he redeemed it. And there are college kids I worked with, they're changing the world today. And they'd say, Basden, you're one of the key people that blessed me. But it didn't feel like it at the time. That may not be where you're going. That's my best shot. We got just a minute or two before we go. You want to respond to that?
Just real quickly, all right? So there's some people who believe in the blueprint view of life. So for example, that God's already determined everything. So when you make a college decision, like, what happens if I miss the one? So but here's the deal. Like, some people think that, God has already determined who's going to marry who, all that kind of thing. But here's the thing, because God doesn't force us to do things against our will. So what if I was supposed to marry somebody, but I said no, and I was sinned, and I married this person over here? Well, what's going to happen to this person? Do they get married, or what happens to the person who's supposed to marry that person? In reality, so when I finally realized that there's no blueprint for where you go to college or maybe who you marry, but so when you make a decision, here's what I realized. God is the great adapter. And you make the best decision you can. You visit, you pray, you sense. And if you get there and you go, this isn't for me, then you go, hey, God, adapt, help me do this, help me find a meaning here, or help me find the next place. So that's the thing, is that just because you make the wrong decisions, that does mean God, well, sorry, sucks to be you, you're out of here. No, he is the great adapter. And here's the thing, if you will always open your life to him, even when you make these bad decisions like Paul did, I just said no, when you open your life to him like Paul did.
Both.
Okay. What happens is you will never know the difference, right? As long as your heart is open and you're following Jesus and you're seeking to be with him and live under his gracious reign, you will never know what you missed, because it will still be good and fulfilling and enriching because you're living in his kingdom. That's all I got.
Hey, in closing, I just want to give you all a prayer that I hope you will memorize and use it a lot. And here it is. Lord, and for every big decision you have to make, this is the prayer to pray. Ready? Lord, open doors no one can close, and closed doors no one can open. If you pray that, Lord, open doors no one can close. Lord, don't let me close those doors if you're trying to keep them open. And Lord, closed doors no one can open. Even if I'm yanking on it, just you be sovereign. If you yield into that, to his love, he won't miss it. Hey, thank y'all so much. We're honored to be with you. God bless you guys.
Thank you, guys.